the collector of memories. The trading post at Haven's Edge never truly slept. Ships came and went at all hours, carrying cargo and passengers between the civilized core worlds and the wild frontier beyond. It was a place where questions weren't asked and credit spoke louder than laws. Perfect for someone who wanted to disappear. Commander Elena Vasquez had been disappearing for 3 years now. She sat in the darkest corner of Murphy's bar, nursing a glass of synthetic whiskey that tasted like regret and watching the crowd through tired eyes. The bar served anyone with money, which meant the clientele was a mix of species that would have been shooting at each other in more civilized space. Elena preferred it this way. Out here, nobody cared about her service record or the metals gathering dust in a storage unit back on Earth. Here, she was just another salvage operator trying to make enough credits to keep her ship running and her past buried. The whiskey burned going down, but not enough to wash away the memories that surfaced every time she closed her eyes. 3 years since the Void War ended. 3 years since humanity proved to the galaxy that they were more dangerous than anyone had imagined. 3 years since Elena learned that some victories cost more than defeats. A shadow fell across her table. Elena looked up to see something that made her hand instinctively move toward the plasma pistol hidden beneath her jacket. The creature standing beside her booth was tall and angular, with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer in the bar's dim lighting. Forearms ended in delicate multi-jointed fingers, and its head was crowned with a collection of sensory organs that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. "Commander Vasquez," the alien said in accented standard. Its voice carried harmonics that suggested it could produce sounds far beyond human hearing. "I am Kethvar of the Threnody Research Collective. I have been searching for you." Elena's grip tightened on her weapon. The Threnody had been neutral during the war, but that didn't mean they could be trusted. "I'm not a commander anymore, just a salvage operator, and I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." Kethvar's sensory organs dimmed slightly, a gesture Elena recognized as disappointment among his species. "I am not here to purchase anything. I am here to listen. My people are archaeologists and historians. We collect stories from across the galaxy, preserving the experiences of different species for future generations. Find someone else's story to collect." Elena turned back to her drink, hoping the alien would take the hint and leave. Instead, Kethvar slid into the booth across from her with movements that were surprisingly graceful for such a large creature. The Void War changed everything. Before the Devourers came, humans were seen as newcomers to galactic civilization. Young, inexperienced, not particularly dangerous. Now every species knows what your people are capable of when threatened. Elena's laugh was bitter. "Scared of us now, are they? Good. Maybe it'll keep them from starting another war." "Some are frightened," Kethvar admitted, "but others are fascinated. Your species accomplished things during the war that defy conventional military doctrine. Individual humans performed feats that our strategists still cannot explain. I wish to understand how this was possible. Read the official reports." "I have. They are sanitized accounts written by politicians and generals who were not present for the actual fighting. I need to hear from someone who was there, someone who saw what really happened." Elena studied the alien's face, trying to read the emotions behind those alien features. The Threnody were known for their honesty, almost to a fault. They couldn't lie the way humans couldn't shade the truth or omit inconvenient details. If Kethvar said he wanted to understand, he meant it literally. "Why me specifically?" she asked. "Because you commanded the defense of Terra Nova Colony. Because you fought in 12 major engagements against the Devourers. Because you are one of only 3 human officers to survive direct combat with a Devourer Queen." Kethvar's bioluminescent patterns shifted to what Elena had learned indicated sincerity among his people. "And because you disappeared after the war ended, which suggests the experiences affected you deeply." Elena finished her whiskey and signaled the bartender for another. The alcohol was making everything feel distant and unreal, which was exactly how she preferred to experience her memories. "You want to understand humans? Here's the short version. We're crazy. We do things that make no sense to sane species. We fight when we should run. Sacrifice when we should preserve ourselves and never know when to quit. Is that enough understanding for your collection? It is a beginning, Kethvar said patiently. But I need specifics. Stories. Examples of this behavior you describe. The bartender brought Elena's fresh drink. She took a long sip, feeling the familiar burn of cheap alcohol and cheaper memories. Around them, the bar continued its nightly routine of casual violence and desperate commerce, a perfect backdrop for the kind of stories Kethvar wanted to hear. You really want to know what humans are capable of? Elena asked. You want to understand why the galaxy is scared of us now? More than anything. Elena stared into her glass, for a long moment, seeing reflections of faces she wished she could forget. When she looked up, her eyes held a hardness that made the alien's sensory organs pulse with what might have been concern. Then I'll tell you about Chief Engineer Marcus, Chen and the siege of Outpost Omega. I'll tell you about Dr. Sarah Kim and what she did on Kepler Station. And maybe, if you can stomach it, I'll tell you about Terra Nova and the choice I made that saved 10,000 lives and damned my soul. Kethvar leaned forward, his 4 hands folded carefully on the table. I am prepared to listen to whatever you wish to share. Elena took another drink, longer this time, and began to speak. The thing you have to understand about the Void War is that we were completely unprepared for it. The Devourers came from dark space, beyond the galactic rim, moving in swarms that blocked out stars. They didn't communicate, didn't negotiate, didn't even seem to recognize other species as intelligent life. They just consumed everything in their path. The memories came flooding back despite the alcohol, massive ships that looked more grown than built, covered in organic armor and armed with weapons that turned matter into energy, and energy into weapons. Creatures the size of space stations that moved with the coordination of a single organism. First contact was a disaster, Elena continued. The diplomatic fleet that tried to establish communication was destroyed in minutes. The Devourers harvested every molecule of matter from the ships and crew, leaving only empty space behind. That's when we realized we weren't dealing with a civilization. We were dealing with a force of nature. Kethvar's bioluminescent patterns shifted to indicate rapt attention. How did humanity respond to this threat? The same way we respond to everything that threatens us, Elena said. We got creative and mean. The regular military tactics didn't work against an enemy that could adapt to any strategy within hours. So we started thinking outside the box, way outside. She paused to take another drink, gathering her thoughts. The first story would be the hardest to tell because it established the pattern that would define the entire war. Humans doing impossible things in impossible situations, succeeding through sheer bloody-minded determination and creative insanity. Outpost Omega was a mining station on the edge of the Kepler system. She began. Nothing special, just a few 100 workers extracting rare metals from asteroids. When the Devourer swarm arrived, the evacuation ships had already left. Only one man remained behind to shut down the mining equipment and prevent it from falling into enemy hands. Elena's voice grew quieter as she continued. Chief Engineer Marcus Chen, 43 years old, 2 kids back on Earth, 20 years of experience with heavy industrial equipment. He was supposed to trigger the station's self-destruct and escape in an emergency pod. Instead, he decided to stay and fight. The alien's sensory organs pulsed with confusion. One human against an entire swarm? Surely this was not a rational decision. Rational? Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. Nothing about what Chen did was rational, but it worked. For 3 days, one middle-aged engineer held off a Devourer fleet using nothing but mining equipment and pure human stubbornness. Kethvar settled back in his seat, his forearms folding in a gesture that indicated he was prepared for a long story. Around them, the bar's patrons continued their conversations and deals, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about human nature. Elena raised her glass in a mock toast to the memory of a man who had become legend. To Marcus Chen, who taught the galaxy that humans don't know the meaning of impossible odds. She drank deeply and began to tell the story of how one man with a wrench and an attitude changed the course of an interstellar war, The engineer's gambit. Elena set her glass down and stared at the amber liquid for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The bar around them had grown quieter as the night wore on, but she barely noticed. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen the impossible become routine. Marcus Chen wasn't supposed to be a hero, she began. He was a maintenance engineer, not a soldier, the kind of man who fixed broken equipment and complained about safety regulations. But when the Devourer swarm dropped out of hyperspace and began moving toward Outpost Omega, he made a decision that changed everything. Kethvar's sensory organs pulsed with steady blue light, indicating focused attention. What was the tactical situation when the swarm arrived? Hopeless, Elena said bluntly. 37 Devourer ships ranging from frigate-sized hunters to a massive harvester that could process an entire asteroid in minutes. The evacuation fleet had already departed with most of the station's personnel. Chen was alone with enough industrial equipment to strip mine a moon, and 3 days before the main fleet could arrive to retake the system. She took another sip of whiskey, feeling the familiar burn. Standard military doctrine called for immediate retreat or surrender. The Devourers didn't take prisoners, but they also didn't waste time chasing individual escape pods. Chen could have triggered the self-destruct and gotten away clean. But he chose to remain, Kethvar observed. Was this loyalty to his employers? A desire for glory? Elena shook her head. Nothing that noble. Chen stayed because he was angry. The Devourers had already consumed 3 mining colonies in neighboring systems. Thousands of workers, just like him, had been harvested for biomass. Men and women with families, dreams, futures. The swarm treated them like raw materials. The alien's bioluminescent pattern shifted to what Elena recognized as confusion among his species. Anger is not typically considered a sound basis for military strategy. You're thinking, like a rational being, Elena replied. Humans aren't rational when we're protecting something we care about. Chen didn't see the mining station as just another piece of corporate property. He saw it as a symbol of human determination, human ingenuity. Every piece of equipment represented years of development, testing, and refinement. Every tool was a testament to human ability to shape the universe to our will. She paused, remembering the intercepted communications from those 3 days. Chen's voice, calm and professional, even as he described impossible feats of engineering and combat. The first wave of Devourer scouts arrived 6 hours after the evacuation fleet departed. Chen was in the main engineering bay, ostensibly preparing the self-destruct sequence. Instead, he was converting mining charges into improvised torpedoes. Kethvar's head tilted in a gesture that indicated intense interest. Mining charges are designed for controlled demolition, not ship-to-ship combat. Exactly. But Chen had been working with explosives for 20 years. He understood blast patterns, timing, and shaped charges better than most military engineers. He stripped the safety limiters from 50 mining charges, programmed them with new detonation sequences, and loaded them into the cargo launchers that normally transported ore to processing ships. Elena could still picture the technical specifications she had read in Chen's after-action report. Modifications that should have taken weeks of careful planning, accomplished in hours through sheer desperate innovation. When the first scout ship moved into harvesting position, Chen launched his improvised torpedoes. The Devourers weren't expecting resistance from a mining station, so their shields were configured for asteroid deflection, not combat. Did the attack succeed? The first scout ship was completely destroyed, Elena confirmed. The explosion was visible from 3 systems away, but that was just the beginning. Chen had converted the entire mining station into a weapons platform. She gestured with her glass, sloshing the whiskey slightly. Ore refineries became projectile weapons. Gravity manipulators designed for moving asteroids became tractor beams capable of pulling ships off course. Fusion torches meant for breaking up space rocks became improvised plasma cannons. Chen turned every piece of civilian equipment into an instrument of war. Kethvar's patterns shifted to indicate amazement. The technical knowledge required for such conversions would be extraordinary. Chen had something more valuable than technical knowledge, Elena said. He had desperation and complete freedom to ignore safety protocols. When you're facing certain death anyway, you can push equipment far beyond its design limitations. The alien leaned forward, clearly fascinated. How did the Devourers respond to this unexpected resistance? Elena's expression grew darker. They adapted. That was their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. The swarm sent heavier ships to deal with what they perceived as a military installation. But Chen adapted too, and he had something the Devourers didn't understand. Which was human creativity under pressure. Elena finished her drink and signaled for another. The Devourers operated on biological programming, efficient, coordinated, but ultimately predictable. Chen was operating on pure human stubbornness and 20 years of experience fixing things that weren't supposed to break. She continued, her voice taking on a quality that suggested she was reciting from memory. Day 2 of the siege. Chen had destroyed 6 more Devourer ships using increasingly creative weapons, but the main harvester was moving into position. That ship was big enough to consume the entire station in one feeding cycle. Kethvar waited patiently as Elena gathered her thoughts. The story was clearly difficult for her to tell, not because of trauma, but because it represented something fundamental about human nature that even she struggled to understand. Chen had one weapon left, she said finally. The station's main fusion reactor, not as a bomb but as a power source for something that had never been attempted before. What did he attempt? Elena looked directly at the alien, her eyes reflecting the bar's dim lighting. He turned the entire asteroid field into a weapon. The mining station was positioned in the center of a dense cluster of metallic asteroids, each one seeded with gravitational anchors for harvesting operations. Chen overloaded the station's gravitational manipulators and used the fusion reactor to power an artificial gravity well. The technical implications hit Kethvar immediately. His sensory organs flashed bright blue with shock. The mass displacement alone would have been catastrophic. The gravitational stresses would have torn apart anything caught in the field, Elena confirmed, including the mining station. Chen had exactly 17 minutes to evacuate before the gravity well collapsed and took everything with it. But the Devourer harvester was caught directly in the center of the field when it activated, a ship designed to consume planets, torn apart by the same gravitational forces it used to process raw materials. The destruction was so complete that we didn't find debris larger than a coffee cup. Kethvar sat in stunned silence for several moments, processing what he had heard. When he finally spoke, his voice carried undertones that suggested awe mixed with concern. This engineer, Chen, he sacrificed everything to destroy a single enemy ship. Not just one ship, Elena corrected. The gravitational collapse created a debris field that took out another dozen Devourer vessels. But more importantly, it sent a message to the swarm. Humans would rather destroy themselves and everything around them than be harvested passively. She raised her fresh glass in another mock toast. Marcus Chen survived, by the way. Barely. His escape pod was picked up by our rescue fleet 3 days later, half dead from radiation exposure and completely deaf from the gravitational shockwaves, but alive. What happened to him after the war? Elena's expression softened slightly. Last I heard, he was back on Earth teaching engineering at a technical college. Never talks about the war. Never mentions what he did at Outpost Omega. Just fixes machines and goes home to his family every night. Kethvar's pattern shifted to indicate deep contemplation. Your species has an unusual relationship with destruction and creation. This Chen used tools of construction as weapons of war, then returned to peaceful construction afterward. That's the thing about humans, Elena said. We're not naturally violent, we're naturally creative. But when something threatens what we love, that creativity becomes very dangerous very quickly. The alien was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what he had heard. You mentioned earlier that there were other stories, other examples of this human adaptability. Elena nodded slowly. Dr. Sarah Kim and the Kepler station incident. That one's harder to tell because it shows what happens when human creativity meets human sacrifice. When someone decides that their own life is an acceptable price for protecting others. I am prepared to listen, Kethvar said formally. Elena stared into her glass again, seeing reflections of memories she had tried for 3 years to forget. Sarah Kim was a xenobiologist, not a warrior. When the Devourers reached Kepler Station, she made a choice that saved 15,000 lives and proved that sometimes the most dangerous humans are the ones who understand science better than they understand fear. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the next story. But that tale will have to wait for another round. The night is young and some stories require more alcohol than others. Kethvar signaled the bartender for drinks, his alien features showing something that might have been anticipation mixed with dread. He was beginning to understand why other species found humanity so unsettling. It wasn't their capacity for violence. That was truly frightening. It was their capacity for sacrifice, creativity, and absolute determination when protecting something they valued. The bar continued its nightly rhythm around them, but both beings were focused entirely on the stories yet to be told. Stories that would explain why humanity had become the most feared and respected species in the galaxy, and why some victories came at a price that could never be fully paid. The last stand Elena had consumed enough alcohol to dull the sharp edges of memory, but not enough to silence them entirely. The bar had grown quieter as the night progressed, leaving her and Kethvar in their corner booth with only the soft hum of life support systems and the distant murmur of late-night conversations. The alien had listened to 2 stories of human ingenuity and sacrifice, but Elena could see in his bioluminescent patterns that he was waiting for something more personal. Dr. Sarah Kim, Elena began, her voice steadier now despite the alcohol. 32 years old, xenobiology specialist, assigned to Kepler Station for a routine research mission. When the Devourer swarm arrived, she was studying cell samples in a laboratory that hadn't seen combat since it was built. Kethvar's sensory organs pulsed with patient attention. What made this situation different from the previous encounters you have described? Scale, Elena said simply. Kepler Station wasn't a mining outpost or a military installation. It was a civilian research facility with 15,000 people aboard. Scientists, technicians, their families, children who had never seen a weapon fired in anger. She paused to take another sip, feeling the familiar burn of cheap whiskey and expensive memories. The station had minimal defenses, just enough to deter pirates and raiders. When the Devourer swarm dropped out of hyperspace, the evacuation protocols kicked in immediately. Standard procedure was to load the civilians onto transport ships and run for the nearest military base. A logical response to overwhelming force, Kethvar observed. Elena's laugh was bitter. Logic assumed the evacuation would work. The first transport ship to launch was intercepted by Devourer hunters and harvested for biomass before it cleared the station's defensive perimeter. 1,500 people gone in minutes. That's when we realized the swarm wasn't just attacking the station. They were surrounding it. The aliens' pattern shifted to indicate concern. A harvesting formation. They intended to consume everything, including the fleeing civilians. Exactly. Sarah Kim was in Lab 7 when the emergency broadcasts started. She was supposed to report to Evacuation Bay 12 with the other research staff. Instead, she sealed the laboratory doors and began working. Elena's voice grew quieter as she continued. You have to understand, Sarah was brilliant. PhD in xenobiology from Cambridge, master's in biochemistry, 3 years studying alien life forms that most people couldn't even pronounce. She understood organic systems better than anyone on the station. What was she working on in the laboratory? The same thing she'd been studying for 6 months. Devourer cell samples recovered from previous battles. Everyone knew the samples were dangerous. That's why they were kept in maximum containment. But Sarah realized they were also an opportunity. Elena stared into her glass, seeing reflections of a woman she had never met but whose sacrifice had saved thousands of lives. The Devourers weren't just alien invaders. They were a biological weapon engineered for one purpose, consuming and converting organic matter. But every biological system has weaknesses, and Sarah had been mapping those weaknesses for months. Kethvar leaned forward, his forearms folded on the table. She discovered a vulnerability? More than that. She discovered that the Devourer swarm operated as a single organism. Individual ships, individual creatures, but all connected through biochemical signals. like cells in a body or nodes in a neural network. If you could disrupt those signals, the entire swarm would lose coordination. The alien finished, his bioluminescent patterns flashing with understanding. Elena nodded. Sarah synthesized a biological agent using the samples in her laboratory, a targeted virus that would interfere with the biochemical communication network. But there was a problem. The delivery system? The virus was extremely unstable. It would break down within minutes of leaving a controlled environment. The only way to deploy it effectively was to introduce it directly into the swarm's communication network, which meant someone had to carry it to the center of the formation. Elena's hands had begun to shake slightly, and she gripped her glass, tighter to steady them. Sarah Kim volunteered for a suicide mission. She loaded the virus into a modified emergency pod, along with enough life support for a one-way trip to the center of the swarm. Kauthavar's sensory organs dimmed with what Elena recognized as sadness among his species. She sacrificed herself to save the others. It wasn't supposed to be a sacrifice, Elena said quietly. Sarah calculated that she would have enough time to deploy the virus and escape before the pod systems failed. But calculations don't account for human stubbornness. She took another drink, longer this time, trying to wash away the taste of memories that refused to fade. The pod's life support was damaged during the approach to the swarm. Sarah had maybe 10 minutes of air left when she reached the deployment point, enough time to release the virus and start her escape. But she remained to ensure the mission succeeded. Elena's voice became barely a whisper. She stayed to make sure the virus took hold. The biochemical disruption worked, but it needed time to propagate through the swarm's network. Sarah monitored the effect from inside the pod, watching as the devourers lost coordination and began attacking each other. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of sacrifice. Around them, the bar continued its nightly routine, but both beings were focused entirely on the story of a woman who had chosen certain death to save strangers. The virus worked perfectly, Elena continued. The entire swarm tore itself apart within hours. 15,000 people escaped in the evacuation ships while the devourers destroyed each other. Sarah's pod was found 3 days later, life support completely depleted, but the mission logs were intact. Kauthavar was quiet for a long moment before speaking. This pattern of sacrifice, this willingness to die for others, is it common among your species? Elena finished her drink and stared at the empty glass. Common enough to terrify our enemies and break the hearts of our friends. That's what you really want to know, isn't it? Not just how humans fight, but why we fight the way we do. Yes, the alien admitted. Your species has become legend throughout the galaxy. Some fear you as monsters, others revere you as heroes. I need to understand which perception is accurate. Elena was quiet for a long time, wrestling with memories that had driven her to the edge of civilized space and the bottom of too many bottles. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of command decisions that had shaped the course of an interstellar war. Both perceptions are accurate, she said. We're capable of incredible heroism and unspeakable brutality, often in the same action. Sometimes the difference between a hero and a monster is just a matter of perspective. She looked directly at Kauthavar, her eyes reflecting pain that 3 years of alcohol hadn't been able to numb. That brings me to the final story. My story, Terra Nova Colony, and the choice I made that ended the war. The alien's pattern shifted to indicate readiness to listen, but Elena could see uncertainty in his posture. The previous stories had been about other people, heroic figures who could be admired from a distance. This story would be personal, immediate, and far more difficult to categorize. Terra Nova was the last major population center in the Outer Rim, Elena began. 500,000 civilians, including the families of military personnel stationed throughout the sector. When the final Devourer swarm arrived, I was in command of the orbital defense platforms. Elena's voice grew harder as she continued. We had learned from previous battles. We knew their tactics, their weaknesses, their coordination methods. We had the firepower to stop them, but only if we were willing to pay the price. What price? Elena signaled the bartender for another drink, knowing she would need it for what came next. The Devourers had evolved since the early battles. They had learned to use human tactics against us, including taking hostages. The main swarm had captured a civilian transport with 10,000 refugees aboard. Kethvar's bioluminescent patterns flickered with alarm. They were using human civilians as shields? More than that, they were using them as weapons. The transport was rigged to explode if we attacked the swarm directly. 10,000 innocent people would die if we engaged the enemy, but 500,000 would die if we didn't. Elena's hands were shaking badly now, but she forced herself to continue. I had 12 minutes to make a decision: save the 10,000 hostages and lose the colony, or sacrifice them to save the larger population. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background noise of the bar seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of Elena's labored breathing and the soft hum of environmental systems. "What did you choose?" Kethvar asked quietly. Elena stared into her fresh glass of whiskey, seeing reflections of faces she would never forget. "I chose to save the colony. I ordered the attack on the swarm, knowing it would trigger the transport's destruction. 10,000 people died because of my decision, but 500,000 lived. The weight of that choice hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Elena had carried it for 3 years, and it had driven her to the edge of the galaxy and the bottom of countless bottles. The war ended that day," she continued. "The final swarm was destroyed and the Devourer threat was eliminated. Humanity had saved itself through sacrifice, ingenuity, and the willingness to make impossible choices." Kethvar's patterns had dimmed to barely visible levels. "You carry the responsibility for those deaths." "Every night," Elena confirmed. "In my dreams I see their faces. In my waking hours I remember their names. 10,000 people who died because I decided their lives were worth less than the lives of others." She took a long drink, feeling the alcohol burn away some of the pain, but never enough to eliminate it entirely. "That's what you want to understand about humans, isn't it? We're capable of heroism that defies logic and brutality that defies morality, often in the same moment. And yet you continue to live with these choices," Kethvar observed. Elena's laugh was hollow. "Living with it is the punishment. Every human who survived the war carries similar burdens. We saved our species by becoming something that frightens us. We protected our children by sacrificing our innocence." The alien was quiet for a long time, processing everything he had heard. Finally, he spoke in tones that carried harmonics of deep understanding. "Your species fights for love, not for territory or resources or ideology, but for love of others, and that love makes you capable of anything." "Love and loss," Elena corrected. "We fight hardest when we're protecting what we might lose, and we're willing to become monsters to protect what we love." Kethvar's bioluminescent patterns shifted to something Elena had never seen before, a complex interplay of colors that seemed to indicate both respect and sorrow. "I understand now why other species fear humanity. It is not your capacity for violence that terrifies them. It is your capacity for sacrifice." Elena finished her drink and stood up unsteadily, leaving payment on the table. "You wanted to understand humans. Now you do. We're the species that will burn down the universe to protect our children and call it justice." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at the alien. "When you write your report about human nature, remember this. We don't fight because we enjoy it. We fight because we love something more than we love ourselves. And that makes us the most dangerous species in the galaxy." As Elena walked away, into the dimly lit corridors of Haven's Edge Station, Kethvar remained at the table contemplating the stories he had heard. He now understood why humanity had become both feared and respected throughout the galaxy. They were a species that could transform love into warfare, sacrifice into victory, and individuals into legends. The Scavenger's testament was complete, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again.